famines and pestilences. Next in the scenario painted by Jesus before the end of the age are famines, though Padfield gives pestilences, which in Matthew is found in the KJV and some majority readings, but not in the better Greek manuscripts, in my perspective. And in various places there will be famines and earthquakes. I'll give the NASB here. One does not need to go beyond the New Testament to hear of such famines. In the book of Acts, Luke records a prophecy of Agabus to that effect. As you've already find that being discussed, the famine that was going throughout the world in the time of Claudius, and of course we know Paul going from church to church, gathering up funds to help people back in Judea. Clear there were famines, there's no question about that. But neither Luke nor the Apostle Paul apparently connected this famine with prophetic fulfillment of Christ's words in the Olivet Discourse. I find that interesting. That if the famine here is really a reference to what's occurring right before Jerusalem, so that can be the fulfillment. And I grant there are famines before Jesus, after Jesus, between the time, after the time, throughout the world, famines. But surely the Apostle Paul would have known that this was fulfilling prophecy and would have said something about this famine that had this prophetic significance to it, which he doesn't. Josephus, and again also the Roman historian Tacitus, is quoted to confirm the kind of famine mentioned by Jesus, and he tells of Queen Helena's relief, and I'm not going to read all of this, where I want to be sure I have plenty of time for Q&A and for Tommy to answer all the questions. But, oh, you're still here, Tommy. I thought you stepped out. Forgive me. But, you know, we have this situation where you do have clearly famine going on. I'm not questioning that. My question is not whether Josephus speaks of a famine. He does. But also there are many other famines that he doesn't speak of. So I think that's reading a little bit more into the text, and I don't think Josephus is exact enough to this generalized statement of famine to say it's a prediction that has been fulfilled. It is not unusual to have famines in the ancient or even modern world. And certainly these mentioned by Josephus and Tacitus are not more famines than have been experienced in various parts of the world. The biblical text mentions famine over 100 times. What about earthquakes? Earthquakes are a common occurrence throughout the world. One of the most massive in the Mediterranean world happened in the 8th century, which toppled temples, other buildings, and entire cities. J. Marcellus Kick said, regarding the time immediately before the fall of Jerusalem, that there were earthquakes in Crete, Smyrna, Miletus, and on and on and on. And all these places, like Pompeii, was damaged much by an earthquake occurring February the 5th, 63 A.D. But that's not in Judea. It is important for preterists that the various events mentioned by Christ occurred before the destruction of Jerusalem, so that it becomes the major judgment of God on the Jewish people. DeMar sees these happenings as being addressed in the first century community in Judea and not to the entire world, and that's the point I'm making. Where do we put these things together? Are we talking about earthquakes, famines, wars throughout the world? Are we talking about them just occurring in Judea? What is the fulfillment of the prophecy that Josephus is talking about? Well, Josephus' interest is pretty well relegated to the question of Judea, and yet that doesn't solve your problems, because you also have ones that he does not speak of, and you do not have the kind of intensity in some of these things as required, I think, in the words of Jesus, particularly as we see the development in the book of Revelation, which is in fact talking about the same issues. DeMar's understanding of this generation and his identification of the you repeated in the text is referring to the first century audience. That's where he gets it from. My only concern is to demonstrate that the earthquakes and other phenomena were not unusual, occurring before and after the period of time, and do not serve as an introduction to the end of the world within 4 decades of their happening. Moreover, I desire to show that Josephus' words do not spell a disaster of the proportions spoken of in the Olivet Discourse, and certainly not as seen in the Revelation of John. Kistemacher says that the earthquakes mentioned by Jesus should not be directly equated with the earthquakes that occurred near the time of the destruction of Jerusalem. And then I have a lengthy quote here that you can read. By the way, I should tell you one thing I didn't tell you at the beginning. The actual entirety of this paper will be found on the internet, not in your CD. I gave at the time I gave Tommy everything that I had at that point of writing, but now you have it all, and it will be on the internet. So if you run out on your CD, you'll know why. But Kistemacher said these are foreshadowings. Now, Sam Kistemacher is not premill, he's amill. But in reading this passage, he recognizes that these statements that Jesus is talking about are foreshadowings of what is to come, but not something that immediately sort of brings in the final end. There's a time period, sometimes of great extent, and even Sam says that, because he moves into the fact, periods between 60s and 80s, there were famines and pestilences and earthquakes. The Roman Empire had a lot of these things. He said they're not limited to the decade that precedes the fall of Jerusalem. And he said there are several hundred disturbances of all these things at this period of time. So how do you get them connected with Jerusalem since they precede it and follow it? May I introduce at this juncture that even were we to grant that these statements of Jesus about wars and famines and earthquakes and the like speak of what would transpire from AD 33 to 70, a reasonable position, if we consider all of Jesus' words to be restricted to events within Judea, that Christ is acknowledging these events to be the beginning, not the crescendo, of events leading to the sign of His coming and the end of the age. That is, you have them too close in juxtaposition. If these are the beginnings of pains He talks about in these terms, then these would be on the foothills. I mean, they are right on the destruction itself. And what you find in the text seems to be more elongated than that in time. And I'll go on with Donald Hagner, who mentions the fact that they are not in themselves, these events, signal of the end. He quotes on, I'll go on down, I'm not going to read all these quotes to you. It is not yet the time of the proper eschatological work of the Messiah, and therefore the Messiah will not yet be present. It is not yet the transition from this age to the age to come. And so part of my issue with Josephus is that we're talking about such a small period of time between when Jesus said these words and the actual destruction of Jerusalem for them to be just simply the very, very beginning of the situation. Particularly since they like to mention the fact there was an earthquake in 66. And that's right on the very heels of it. As Keener says, ancient prophecy teachers usually listed these events among the signs of the end. The end was often portrayed as preceded by great sufferings or a final war. Jesus says, instead, these events characterize normal life until the end. And I think all we're saying here, and I don't have a major problem with Keener's statements here if taken within context, and that is these wars and rumors of wars and famines and all these things are not really those things. It's just almost like, they happen today, expect Jesus tomorrow. They're setting a stage. They're beginning to happen. They may intensify, but these things have a long time in coming about. And I don't think Josephus' events satisfy that kind of requirement. Fearful events from heaven. More significant than the former signs of common occurrences are the extraordinary sights in the skies, mentioned only in Luke's account. Quote, and there will be terrors and great signs from heaven, end quote. Jesus' use of terrors and great signs would lead one to believe that more than human misfortune and natural calamity is in view. Now think about this with me just a moment. You've got famines and pestilences, which oftentimes come on the heels of famines. And you have these earthquakes and natural calamities. But in reality, when you start seeing fearful events in heaven, these things are a little different than your commonplace, it would seem. The term phobos speaks of a dread sight, something that brings fear, while Semyon refers to something that had a terrifying appearance or never before seen. Padfield connects this statement of Christ with a storm mentioned by Josephus. Got to find that prediction fulfilled here in Josephus. So let's see if this fits. This is a quote from War. For there broke out a prodigious storm in the night, with the utmost violence and a very strong winds, with the largest showers of rain, with continual lightnings and terrible thunderings and amazing concussions and bellowings of the earth. That was in an earthquake. These things were a manifest indication that some destruction was coming upon men. When the system of the world was put into this disorder, and anyone would guess that these wonders foreshadowed some great calamities that were coming. Wow, this is fulfillment of Matthew.